What's really driving the future of IT? How are leaders staying secure, efficient, and ahead of change? Welcome to the Beyond the Firewall podcast, powered by HubTech, where we go past the headlines to talk with technology leaders, industry experts, and IT practitioners shaping how we work, live, and lead. Let's get into today's episode.
Welcome to Beyond the Firewall, powered by HubTech, the podcast where we talk about the real technology challenges leaders face every day. I'm Adam Schaefer, and today's episode is about a hard truth in cybersecurity. Most breaches don't happen because teams don't know what to do. They happen because execution breaks down. Organizations buy the right tools, they write the policies, they check the compliance boxes, and yet they're still vulnerable. Today, we're talking about the gap between security strategy and real-world operations. And I'm joined by two people who live this every day. First, Chris Daggett, technology leader, practitioner, and someone who works directly with organizations implementing real-world IT and security programs. And our featured guest is Steve Brining, CISSP, Certified Cybersecurity Executive with over 20 years of experience building and leading security initiatives. Steve brings deep operational experience plus a unique leadership perspective as a commanding officer in the Arizona National Guard. Chris, Steve, welcome to the Beyond the Firewall podcast. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Adam.
Appreciate having us. Thank you.
So, I'm very excited about having you guys on the show. So, just to kick it off, I mean, I tried to do my little bit of an intro to introduce you, but Steve, I mean, everybody knows Chris at this point, but Steve, did I miss anything cool and interesting about you that I didn't brag about?
I guess I'm also part of FBI InfraGard as well, and it's closer to 30 years now, but it makes me sound younger, so I appreciate that, Adam.
I don't know where I got the 20 from. Okay, no, I forgot how old you really were.
We round up or round down by the decade.
What's the FBI role? What is that?
Just a member of FBI's InfraGard. So threat intelligence feeds, things like that. And seeing things
cool.
A little bit more, even outside of cybersecurity. Get alerts and.
That's awesome.
So
that's awesome. That'll add some value to the conversation. So let's get started and talk just like kind of big picture for a second. And Steve, let's start with you. And when you look at modern breaches, what's the most common root cause you see today?
With modern breaches, I would say execution failure, not necessarily technology gaps. Companies are always building very sophisticated tools, but they sometimes fail at fundamentals like timely patching, doing access reviews, even configuration hygiene. To me, breaches, it seems like they rarely exploit 0 days in per se. They leverage misconfigurations, stolen credentials, unpatched systems that sometimes are actually left unpatched for months. So to me, I would call that process debt, right? Security activities treated as projects rather than a disciplined operation. So when a team lacks clear ownership, having some measurable cadence, if you will, and even leadership accountability for the execution, even the strong tools actually become ineffective, right? So it's not about buying more. It's about consistently doing what you're committed to. I did say something about, I said breaches rarely exploit 0 days. What I mean is 0 days dominate the headlines since associated with like nation states, and they feel like they're very unstoppable. But really, I'm seeing a lot of opportunistic hackers, the ones behind, say, 90+% of the ransomware out there. They take that path of least resistance, like phishing an employee or exploiting some old CVE that's not patched. So companies get obsessed on all these advanced threats while, leaving, RDP exposed to the internet or skipping some quarterly access reviews, right? But for small to medium businesses, attackers are not crafting novel exploits. They run like automated scanners, look for yesterday's vulnerabilities. It's not to dismiss the 0 day risk. It's just to prioritize correctly. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that does. I mean, and that's what I figured. But Chris, from an IT operations perspective, do you see the same patterns?
Oh, absolutely. All the time. Even tiny missed tasks can compound the big, the issue at hand. one skip patch, one firewall rule that nobody ever revisits, a monitoring tool that hasn't sent data in weeks. These are all technical failures. These aren't technical failures, rather, they're operational failures.
So are you guys both saying that cybersecurity, you buy all these tools, you probably have the right stuff, but it's more of a leadership problem, not a technical problem? Is that what you're saying here? Process problem.
I would say yes. You could buy all the tools you can find. However, it comes down to ownership. That's a big piece of it, and being able to operationalize things and integrating it, integrating the tools into the culture. It's cybersecurity is not a checkbox kind of item. It's a culture thing, and it starts with leadership.
Yeah, I would definitely say overwhelmingly it's leadership. I mean, technology is the table stakes, right? But
Right.
the differentiator to me is whether leaders will create conditions for execution, right? Like Chris said, clear ownership. But you got to give people protected time for their hygiene tasks, right? Look, technical teams know what to do, right? They know how to patch, they know how to segment, they know how to monitor. They fail when leadership treats security as some kind of like interrupt-driven work rather than some core operation. But the leaders set the tone, as Chris said, right? If quarterly access reviews are perpetually delayed, right, for more urgent projects, right, you kind of signal security is kind of optional, but culture flows from the top, as Chris was talking about culture.
Yeah, no, I love blaming the boss. It's my favorite. So we all know what we're doing to this damn bosses. So who should really, and I guess I could put it out to both you guys, but whoever wants to answer, who should really own cybersecurity execution?
So, the way it plays out, Adam, is leadership, they own the risk. The security team would own the strategy. IT would own the execution and the follow through of the strategy.
Yeah, I was going to say, Adam, really quick, like, there's accountability and responsibility, right? Accountability can't be delegated, right? So the business leader's accountability for the asset, not just IT, right? CISOs can own framework and guidance, right? Business unit heads may own within their domains, like CFOs own the financial system security, right? CMO, customer data, right? So that's kind of how I see it. IT enables, but the business executes, right, in that situation.
So are you saying shared responsibility or not shared responsibility?
For me, shared ownership fails when it's not structured with clear handoffs and escalation paths. Right? You have to think of it like in the Olympics, right? Like a relay race. If you got 4 runners that are jointly responsible for the baton, but no one knows exactly when to grab it, right? The baton's going to hit the ground. Right? It's an analogy. I don't know how well that's going to work, but in security, let's just say these things happen, right? Now, let me give an example. Like the SOC and the infrastructure team, right, will share ownership of vulnerability remediation, right? SOC identifies the flaws, infrastructure patches, but without any kind of defined service level agreements for the handoff. For example, SOC will escalate critical vulnerabilities within 4 hours. Infrastructure acknowledges it within 1 hour. The item sits, I will say, like in some email purgatory, right? So psychologically, shared ownership to me triggers very a diffusion of responsibility. Again, if it's when, say, 3 leaders are accountable, each assumes the others are handling it. No one wants to step on each other's toes, right? So silence prevails until a breach occurs.
Yeah.
So.
No, that's a good point. So, I like the relay race, the baton pass.
Okay.
That's a good analogy.
It works.
I'm gonna copy that. And so you mentioned, Steve, before SMBs, and so I talk to and work with a lot of SMBs, and they think, oh, I just need to put this thing on my system and I'm covered. Nobody cares about us. We're too small. Nobody's trying to break in. I mean, so what, where do SMBs usually fall short? I mean, I see that, but I don't know if that's the norm.
Prioritization analysis. They try to mimic some enterprise program with like 1/10 of the resources. right? So instead of focusing on, say, the 20% of controls that prevent 80% of the breaches, like, I don't know, we talked about patching, a backup, MFA, they chase compliance checklists or shiny tools, right? So where SMBs succeed is when they, for lack of a better term, I know, military, ruthlessly prioritize, right? What will cripple us tomorrow? Say the answer is ransomware, right? So they enforce MFA everywhere, right? They test restores back, say, weekly. They can patch internet-based systems, say, within 14 hours, right? So just be simple, measurable. That's non-negotiable. So prioritization analysis.
And just, Chris, where do you see these SMBs? And SMB just, it's small, medium-sized businesses, but I'm actually thinking small business when I talk about it. And so where do you see the shortcuts that they're taking? Or because I can't imagine they're incredibly thorough.
I mean, essentially what happens, Adam, I mean, based on my experience with the SMB market is, the SMBs fail to document things, have tried and true processes, follow compliance frameworks. Those are, typically they're understaffed and they just don't have the resources to put a good governance program in place and have that operational, process be rock solid. So that, the end-to-end process breaks, at the end of the day. It's, as Steve had alluded to, it's the handoffs, right? And when you're a 1 or 2 person IT shop, you're wearing lots of hats, you can only cover so many bases. And security, unfortunately, tends to become an afterthought in many environments because they're too busy chasing, the little minutia problems around. So where does that leave time in the day to iron out, the end-to-end process, ensure that, you have compliance checks in place, that the documentation is where it needs to be, are they adhering to a WISP, those types of things. So, Steve had alluded to, IT is a lot bigger than, security. And, there's so many little pockets of IT these days that people need to be aware of, in an effort to protect their own environment. Everybody is a target, especially with AI. These hackers can really cast a wide net and, they can take you down really quick. It's the low-lying fruit that they're looking for. They just want to disrupt.
I'm sure everybody knows, but just humor me. Just like tell me what a WISP is.
A WISP is it's a document, it's a written information security program, and it outlines how you run your security program from end to end. So typically there are, underlying policies and procedures that tie into the master document. But this lays out, how you handle vulnerability management, how you handle incident response, so on and so forth. So it's the foundation of any security program.
Thank you. Sorry, I didn't. My guess is everybody knows that. Just wanted to make sure. And so, so now let's just stay with that small team for a second. So you got the small team, 1 or 2 people. They come to work every day. What should be their main focus every day? Like, is there a priority? They can't do everything.
They have to worry about the reactive stuff first. Is there a fire internally that I need to address? Because that's a business stoppage issue. You know what I mean? Depending on the severity of the problem. But there are daily checks, throughout the day. From a security perspective, you're checking patches, patch levels, you're checking versions of agents, you're checking, you're obviously checking your ticket queues and reports. There's just so much data to look at, and especially if you have it set up correctly, you have a lot of different places you need to look to gather that data because it's typically not in one single report. So, there's a lot to tackle.
Yeah, they can always outsource and get a managed service provider. That wouldn't be such a bad idea.
Yes,
but
yes.
I don't want to.
That can be a very cost-effective measure for sure.
But I don't want to be too pushy there. And then, so Steve, what do you see as the biggest execution mistake that these growing companies are making?
I would say treating security as a scaling problem when it's actually a discipline problem. right? So say a company grows from say 50 to 500 employees. I guess leaders assume that, they can engineer their way out of risk. Hey, let's buy more tools, right? Let's hire a CISO. Let's implement some frameworks. But they still neglect to, like, say, institutionalize their operational habits that actually prevent breaches, right? So when something worked informally with 20 people, honestly, it collapses at 200. At a startup, the founder might personally review every access request, but at 200 employees, that's impossible, right? But too many companies never replace that informal discipline with a scalable process. Instead, they'll take some IGA tool or some identity governance and administration tool, and they'll say, "Yay, we have victory," while their access reviews still slip through the cracks, right? Because no one owns that workflow, right? No deadlines exist, right? And leadership never measures completion, right? The tool's there, but the execution isn't.
That's great. And Chris, going back to the WISP or the written documentation, I know a lot of companies that have tools that people document everything, but yet somehow the written policies fail. I mean, in daily operations, tell me if I have it wrong. Do you see that, and why is that happening?
It's always the last thing. Every time I meet with a customer, I ask them about their documentation, and they say they don't have time for it. They're too busy working. That's the canned response that I normally will get. These companies need to really change their thought process on how they handle, security. They need to make sure that everybody that's involved in the end-to-end process, the handoffs, so on and so forth, turn into muscle memory. That's really when you have a nice streamlined, process. When people don't have to think about things, they're cool about it. They don't panic. They just go on with their day and everything is seamless. That's when you'll have the most success.
I was going to say, let me just, one thing
Please.
to tie into that. I would just say, because you're saying policies, right, fail in daily operations. My old adage was policies describe ideals, workflows determine behavior.
Right. No, I would agree with that.
So what's the difference between the policy and the workflow? Is that like, that's the tactics that you're taking?
Well, a policy may say review access quarterly, right? But if there's no calendar invite exists, right? No tools, no tool to
nobody assigned to that task, as well.
Exactly. So you got to translate policy into workflow, all right, and automate that access report, assign the owners, and set the deadlines and things like that.
And you mentioned culture before, and I imagine culture comes from the top. But Steve, talk a little bit more about why culture is important. Like, why is that sometimes the secret sauce?
It's interesting. When I went to warrant officer school, they said, do the right things when no one else is watching. Right. So culture, to me, it's like, if you think it's like the operating system that determines whether your controls actually execute when no one's watching. Right. So I would say that security culture, it's three tangible ways. First, you got this psychological safety to speak up. Right. In strong cultures, some junior analysts might escalate some oddities without fear of embarrassment. Right. Weak ones, people stay silent because false alarms are, they get punished. Right. And breaches rarely surprise resilient organizations. Right. They surface. Right. I would say shared burden versus siloed ownership. Right. When security is the CISO's job. Right. You have to look at it like, I'm just changing gears. I would say leadership modeling. Culture flows downhill. I had an old CEO say culture eats strategy for breakfast. That just randomly came here. But culture does flow downhill, right? If executives bypass MFA, right, because it slows me down. Well, you've just taught the organization that security is optional for important people, right? But if the CEO publicly shares how MFA blocks, say, a compromised password last month, that would signal to the company that security matters more than convenience, even at the top. And it's not really posters or annual training, right? It's got to be a consistent reinforcement of behaviors within a company as well. Weak cultures, they treat security as a constraint. Strong cultures, they treat it as really a competitive advantage to them.
I love the do the right thing when nobody's looking. I teach my kids that all the time. I mean, I think that's brilliant. I didn't have to go to the military for that though, but I mean, I think it is true. I think that's
I learned through a lot of push-ups.
You know, I read a book. So anyway, but that is a really good way of looking at it. And so now kind of jumping around a little bit to kind of going to leadership, but more about you, Steve. Like, do you feel like the military leadership helped you become a great cybersecurity evangelist, manager, all the different things you've done in security?
Yeah, I mean, look, leadership is leadership. One of the things that the military is really strong in is training. And, you're going to have, just like in any organization, you have good leaders, you have bad leaders, but you learn from both, right? And over 20 years in the military, I've had some really great leaders and I've had not as great leaders. And I've learned from both of those. And sometimes you say, thanks for teaching me not what to do. But also I've had people on the side as mentors. And that was really important to me from the military perspective. So I think it's really helped me. Like, you got to sometimes just stick your neck out there. And we always say, pick the battles in order to win the war. Right. And it's kind of the same thing. And you have to learn that with the ebbs and flows with your mentorship. So it's definitely helped me.
I thought you were going to say something like it taught me this discipline or something like that. But it's interesting that you talked about having good mentors.
The thing is there's two principles, right? There's commander's intent, right? And then discipline rehearsal, right? In the military, you determine the outcome. We're going to secure this terrain, right? Not every step, right? Empowered teams get to adapt. So in cyber, it means leaders will define the risk tolerance, right? We're going to have no unpatched internet-facing systems, but to let the teams choose the methods. The other, to me, for the military was rehearsal execution until it's muscle memory, right? Tabletops aren't about perfect plans. They're about building some calm, coordinated response under stress, right? Crisis reveals training. It doesn't create it.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And it leads to the next question. So Chris, let's just say there's a cyber incident. How would an IT leader prepare their teams for the pressure when there is an incident? Is there pressure? I would assume there is.
Oh, there absolutely is. As Steve had alluded to, it's all about, the tabletop exercises, getting people comfortable with, what's happening. There are going to be things that you're going to come across that you've never seen before, but you have to keep a cool head.
Would you see people panic?
Oh yeah. Yep. Yeah. People freeze up. And then sometimes people their anxiety builds up so much that they become, kind of frozen. But this is why it's very, very important, to just continue to go through training until it becomes that muscle memory. And then it really takes that chaos out of that exercise, because these cyber breaches, the response, incident response is a very common thing. And it's probably the number one thing that any company needs to focus on today. They will experience it and it will be consistent.
So Steve, do you see people freaking out and losing it during an incident?
I can write a book on this one, Adam.
Oh yeah.
So I would say that how a leader communicates during incident, right? I would say, and I use the terms, the term I use is preserve cognitive capacity for responders, right? Panic is contagious. Calm is catalytic to me, right? So every message that you send either is going to free up the mental bandwidth for the team to solve the problem or consume it with anxiety or ambiguity, or in my case, political noise, right? So to me, I would make sure you over communicate the cadence, not speculation. That's the first thing. You got to also shield the responders from the noise. You got to be that good filter, right? Your job isn't to be the smartest person in the room as the leader. It's to be that filter. I always say that as commanding officers, we're the consummate filters, right? But if we translate that to corporate America, when the board, say, asks for hourly updates, you got to translate that pressure into maybe more some structured briefings, not constant pings to the incident commander, right? A third would be measured urgency, right? Tone matters more than words. If you're frantic in your updates, that's catastrophic, right? That can trigger that flight or fight response to people. We have a serious situation here. We've activated the plan. We've contained the initial scope. Next priority is determining the data exposure. I have confidence in this team. That's not sugarcoating. I'm trying to do it with pressure without capabilities, right? It's hard, but we're trained for hard. But I would say post-incident communication separates really good leaders from average ones. And I've learned this one. You don't wait for some forensic report to acknowledge impact, right? Share what you know, what you don't, and what you're doing to the affected parties, right? Transparency isn't admission of failure. It's just, in my case, proof of control in this situation.
Who are you sharing with, though? Like when you say that, because I often think, do they just keep it in their little team, or do they let everyone in the company know what's going on?
Well, it depends on what the workflow is in your incident response plan, right? Depending on timing, it could be the PR team does it. It may be the CEO that actually does the messaging. And if the CEO is going to do the messaging, maybe the PR team needs to do it, right? If you translate that, in military language, right, public affairs gets involved if the message has to go outside, right? But there's workflows, right? And that's why having those exercises about what is the proper workflow and who owns ownership of the communications is very important when it comes to how you communicate, right? It could be communications, it could be legal, it could be stakeholder updates. What I'm trying to say is everyone in that chain, though, the tone really matters, and being calm. Don't panic in any of them.
And I think get the messaging out
to the right people at the right time.
Yeah. Chris, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think to add to that, there are always lessons learned after any given incident. You can always look to sharpen the pencil, and you need to modify incident response plans and disaster recovery plans accordingly, based on findings and where your gaps are. So, there's this one piece where it's the rock solid execution, and you might think you have all these bases covered, but you may uncover some things that you just haven't even thought of. And, you really need to kind of modify your process and your documentation appropriately to make it a little more seamless.
Great. I mean, so calm leadership wins the race, right? That's the game. I would never be able to do this job. I'd be freaking out. I'd be screaming. So don't. I'm not the cybersecurity leader. Sorry about that, guys.
You get a little desensitized to the anxiety, Adam, after time.
No, that's great. And I guess it's like, what habits should IT leaders build into their teams? I mean, is the habit to stay calm? Is the habit to follow the processes and the workflows? What is the habits? You talked about build a habit.
Well, everybody has a role. They need to understand their role, their responsibility. If you think about a RACI model, right? You have parties that are responsible, accountable, ones that are informed, things like that. That all comes into play with these incident response plans. Leadership typically needs to be informed. You have the feet on the street kind of doing their thing. Everybody has a role to play, and it's just a matter of getting comfortable with the overall exercise and understanding what your role is in the big picture.
And how, Steve, how often should you be testing? Like testing your operational plan?
Well, I would say first you test differently based on criticality, right? Not on some single calendar schedule, right? You want to have some tiered rhythm that matches business impact with what I'll call rehearsal intensity, right? So if it's mission critical workflows, ransomware response, CEO account compromise, or you got to isolate some cloud tenant, right? You may be testing quarterly with realistic constraints, right? Not full day tabletops, 45-minute pressure drills, right? It's 4:30 in the afternoon on Friday. SOC just confirmed the ransomware on 3 finance servers. You got 10 minutes to brief me on containment steps, right? And who you've already notified. The goal, what I'm trying to say is the goal isn't perfect answers, right? It's revealing where handoffs stall, and who hesitates on pre-authorized decisions, and whether communication channels work under stress. But also, I would say for how often, for more core hygiene processes like backup restores, access reviews, patching cadence, me personally, I would look at it like testing that monthly through actual execution, not some simulation. Restore one production system from backup during business hours and measure that time to recovery. Pull a random sample of privileged accounts and verify recertification happen. They're not really tests to me, they're operation validations, if you will, that get baked into those workflows. If you wouldn't do it monthly, you're not really going to consider it critical. But if it's low frequency, right, but high impact, like say in my case, nation state intrusions, board level breach disclosure, you might want to go into some annual deep dive simulation with executives present in that situation.
Is it like a surprise? Like you just don't tell them, and then all of a sudden you say, it's like on the submarine. Okay, boom, boom, we're being attacked.
Well, Brazilian organizations already expect this stuff, right? So it's a culture thing we went back to. I guess my rule of thumb on that would be, if a plan hasn't been stress tested in the last 90 days, assume it won't work out when it's needed, because muscle memory does degrade fast. I mean, you know, you work out and you're sick for 2 weeks. It's amazing how hard it is to get back in shape, right? But testing isn't about perfection, right? It's about exposing the gaps before your attackers do. Because let's face it, during a real incident, you won't rise to your aspirations, right? You're going to default to your training. So you got to make sure that the training happened recently under pressure, and then having consequences for improvement.
Cool. So with that, you know, we talked about a bunch of stuff. What are we not talking about that we haven't touched on? Because I want to make sure that you guys have a chance to, kind of give us your final thoughts on cybersecurity in general. You know, so what are we not talking about that we should let people know about? Chris?
I think ownership of tools is very, very important. You know, companies tend to have a lot of shadow IT happening, and what that means is you have folks from different business lines, not necessarily IT. They're buying tools off the shelf. And, IT needs to understand how to make sure that those tools are being, used securely. But, there's an ownership piece of it as well. If you can have a robust tool stack, but if nobody has ownership of each tool and nobody is ensuring that the tools are rolled out securely, they're patched, or the processes are in place, the handoffs are there, so on and so forth, then you're going to have a lot of gaps in your environment.
That's no good. And Steve, what's your kind of final advice of maybe stuff we're not touching or not talking about enough?
Measure, if I had to finalize it, like measure your execution velocity, not the tool counts, right? Yeah, you got to have ownership in the tool counts, as Chris alluded, definitely, or the tools. But what I mean by, say, track cycle times, right? Days to patch critical systems, hours to acknowledge an escalated alert, right? Percentage of access reviews completed on schedule. Review these metrics weekly, right? Alongside revenue and uptime, right? But stop buying your way into security, right? Start leading your way there, right? Measure execution, not the number of tools you have per se, right? Protect that time for the hygiene work, right? And then the teams that are actually doing the fundamentals and doing them well, celebrate that, right? Because breaches aren't caused by missing tools, if you will, although tools are needed in the stack. To me, they're caused by missing discipline. People already know what to do, but you got to lead by execution with that.
Yeah, and
It's
the
interesting.
execution
I always
starts from the top.
want all the toys. I always want all the tools. But Chris, you were saying, I'm sorry.
And to add to Steve, the leadership, it starts at the top. Again, it all leads back to culture and execution.
So what I learned that I should definitely not be a cybersecurity leader. I want to buy too many tools, and I don't have a written process. But this is all incredibly important. I learned a lot for myself of what not to be when I grow up. But thank you very much for joining us today. I also wanted to thank the folks at Acronis. They're sponsoring this podcast, and kind of a shout out to them. They're a great partner and a great company to work with. So thank you, Acronis. That's all the kind of promo I'll do. And with that, I'm going to say thank you very much for joining us today, and we'll be back in touch soon.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, everybody.
People can go crazy trying to stop a cyber attack. Acronis, take the headache out of IT security.
Thanks for tuning in to the Beyond the Firewall podcast powered by HubTech. If you found this conversation useful, follow or subscribe wherever you listen to stay updated on new episodes. For more information about HubTech's IT solutions and services, please visit hubtech.com.